Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. I know everybody is so busy now, some working from home, some back into the office, but we're really glad that you could make this session. Throughout lockdown, our clients have been asking us about what they can do to adapt their PR strategy in the new normal, and how to get the most return on their investment. And more we're seeing growing appetite for digital communications, and how we can demonstrate to the board what we're delivering. It's just so important, and it's such an effective tool, particularly at this time. So we're really glad to bring you this webinar this morning where we can talk you through some insights around this. So joining me today, I have our two panelists. So Charlie Anstall, who is Managing Partner and leads up the Financial and Professional Services team at Newgate Communications. Charlie has got decades of experience in this sector, I'm sure you won't mind me saying. And prior to joining Newgate, he was the Global Head of Mobile Banking at Santander Bank in Madrid for 6 years. And he also was Head of Digital Assets. So he's got lots of experience in this, both from being a client in-house and also advising clients in his consulting role at Newgate. Also joining us is Tom Flynn, who is a partner and heads up our social and digital function at Newgate Communications. Tom is also highly experienced in this. Tom has worked with all kinds of brands, from consumer brands and high street brands that everybody would know, through to B2B and corporate clients, and also political parties. So there really isn't much that Tom doesn't know about this area. Like I said, we're really glad that you could join us this morning. I know people are still joining in now, but I think we'll start the session. So I'm going to hand over to our panelists. If at any time you want to ask a question to our panelists, please do using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. What we're going to do is we're going to sort of quickly run through two separate things. First of all, I'm going to talk through a little bit of the secular trends that we're seeing that have come about as a result of COVID. And then Tom's going to go into a little bit of detail about how this might impact your communication strategy and how you can apply and adapt some new thinking to how you communicate with people. So I'm going to try and run my bits around about 15 minutes. I think Tom's going to do similar. And then we'll open it up for questions for around about 15 minutes also. So I think one of the things that's very important to talk about is how COVID-19 and the arrival of this pandemic has really transformed the way that people are behaving. And I think that the key thing to understand in terms of how the media has been transformed sits around that key element of change of behavior and consumer behavior. So I'm just going to talk you through a couple of slides that McKinsey have done, which talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 and how it's really impacted every area of our life, from work through to learning, to communications, to how we shop, to what we do at home, how we enjoy ourselves and spend our leisure time, and how we feel about health and well-being. And I think, rather than going through all the different elements here, the one common thread that is transforming everything is digital. So if you look at work, people have moved to remote working very, very rapidly. So this secular trend we saw away from people working in offices to working at home has been accelerated very, very quickly. When it comes to elements like communications and information, that's moved almost entirely online, because in-person sampling and in-person interactions have disappeared overnight. In the advertising industry, outdoor advertising has disappeared overnight, its impact. And if you look at shopping and consumption, we've probably seen this as the most direct manifestation of our change in behavior. People have moved to online shopping incredibly rapidly. And if we look also at how we consume media or our entertainment and leisure time, people have moved away from going to the cinema to getting things from Netflix. And these were all trends that were going on previously, but they've been accelerated incredibly quickly. I think what this has created what I would call a genuine integration and fluidity in the way that people behave, particularly in that nexus between work and personal life. And if I look back to sort of 20 odd years ago, and I am slightly showing my age here, when I first started out in the workforce, the culture of being in the workforce was very, very different. I mean, for example, you wouldn't ever make a personal phone call from work because the assets that you would use at work would be very specific to work itself. You wouldn't use the company phone to make a personal phone call. But now that we start to have this fluidity where people bring their own devices into work, and then more recently, when people start working from home, you start to get a real fluidity between how people behave, how they consume media, how they operate their lives in a very fluid, flexible, and integrated way. And of course, in turn, that's really sort of driving an acceleration in some of the trends that we've seen and how people consume media. So, how rapid is this acceleration? Well, if we look at the next slide, you can see that some of the trends we were seeing already have been accelerated to the degree that you're seeing decades of progress in a number of weeks. So once again, I have to thank McKinsey for this analysis. You're seeing that online delivery has effectively advanced 10 years in terms of the projections for its penetration in the market in only 8 weeks. This very fascinating fact that Disney Plus achieved in 2 months what it took Netflix 7 years to achieve. Remote working, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact of Zoom. All of this has been very, very accelerated. But it is important to note these trends were all existing prior to COVID. What we're seeing is a manifestation of this acceleration, which means that people's behaviors changed incredibly rapidly. And that in turn means that companies need to react very, very quickly, and the media needs to react very quickly because the media has been very heavily impacted. So how does this manifest itself in terms of the customer journey? Well, it really affects everything about how we communicate with clients, and that includes both B2C and B2B clients, because the way that consumers take, or even B2B clients, look for information, the way they synthesize it, how they purchase, what they do, has all been changed by COVID. All of it incredibly rapidly. So we now know that the average person, when they are buying an item, will run between lots of different forms of media. They won't just go and read Which. They won't just go to the FT and look at an article. They'll read online reviews. They may go onto social media. They may speak to their friends about recommendations. They'll look at case studies. They'll look at videos. And they'll do this in a very seamless, interchangeable way, which means that companies need to start thinking about the fact that this very sort of fluid environment, they have to adapt to. So if your customers are behaving in a different way, you as a company have to behave in a different way too. And I think one of the ways, and I'm going to mine down in a bit more detail about how it's really impacted the media and what that means in a bit more detail. But the sort of key takeaway is that this fluidity means that as a company, you can't stick to the norms you may have used. So if we take the sort of simple concept of on-the-go consumption, the idea that you target people on their daily commute into work, be that with specific social media content or giving them the Evening Standard to read or the Metro to read, that's disappeared. So if you are carrying on using similar strategies to previously, they will not have the same impact. So you need to start thinking about this sort of fluidity and this sort of very different, very integrated way of working and thinking about how your customers are consuming media. Now, moving on to actually how this has impacted media itself, you can already see this digital move very, very quickly. So these are the most recent Ofcom figures. And you've seen from November last year through to this year, this really quite significant increase in people going online. There are some segments where it's more marked than others, but people are, in some segments, are spending an incredible 5 hours every day online. I mean, this is remarkable. These are much higher figures than you ever saw for TV even in the 1950s, the sort of golden era of TV, the sort of Mad Men era where you could reach 80% of American housewives through one TV show. The amount of hours consumed is so much greater online. So you can see where people are going. And this trend, curious enough, it reached its peak as you'd expect in April, right in the height of lockdown, but it hasn't fallen down to lower levels. So as we come out of lockdown, people are still consuming more media. And they're consuming more media online in every age group. So this is not specific to any one age group. Everyone's doing this. And if you look at the publications and how this has impacted them, you see exactly the same trend. So BBC, trusted news source, shot up in early sort of February, March when COVID hit its peak. it's fallen down to levels, but in every occasion, it's fallen down to higher levels. So this sort of transformation towards digital is likely to be a persistent trend. And of course, for someone like BBC News, this has been going on for years. I mean, it's no shock to anyone that BBC News is, along with the Daily Mail, the most read online news website. So, COVID has accelerated this trend, and it's not going to reverse back. It's going to persist, maybe not at the same levels that you saw during lockdown, but it is going to persist going forwards. And this in turn also is reflected, as you'd expect, in social media, though there are some interesting points, I think, to make on social media. I mean, the 42.6 million to 43.4 million increase on Facebook and Messenger doesn't look much in terms of percentage increase. But when you look at the absolute numbers, I mean, this is incredible. That is 800,000 additional people who've gone online over 5 or 6 months and started using Facebook. So it's the equivalent pretty much to the whole of Birmingham going online and using Facebook for the first time. So the numbers you're seeing on social media is incredible. And once again, this trend has been accelerated by lockdown. There are a couple of very specific micro trends within this, which I think are quite interesting. One is the sort of the demise of Snapchat, and really the fact it's being replaced by TikTok. So that's almost a straight substitution. And that's probably likely to be in the younger age groups who typically tend to use these particular channels a bit more. But as a general trend across the board, you're looking at slightly significant increases. You're looking at a lot of people going onto certain channels. Instagram's a slight outlier in terms of the fact that's slightly fallen, partly because its visual nature is very linked to travel, and it's very linked to those sort of areas where you need to be out and about, and where lockdown effectively has impacted their ability to deliver. I think Instagram will come back to those sort of high levels you see once people have the opportunity to travel out a little bit more. So just moving on to the next slide. I think the interesting thing also is how quickly we've adapted to video conferencing, and Zoom is the most obvious example. I mean, these incredible figures going from 498,000 users in December last year to 13.2 million users in May, and those of you may have noticed their results around about a week ago. I mean, they're doing incredibly well. So people have moved very, very quickly to using online video as a form of communication, and becoming very comfortable with it. And this is across all age groups too. So if you think about the last time you probably had a conversation with elderly relatives, it almost certainly was online in this sort of forum. I think in terms of long-term winners that we're likely to see also, I personally believe that Microsoft Teams probably will come out as the long-term winner, because it's already integrated very much into people's day-to-day work life. So it's going to sort of shore up that work audience in a way that maybe Zoom might not capture so much. But it's definitely worth looking at this space, because obviously this becomes a key opportunity to communicate with people through this new channel that's really appeared from nowhere. And the interesting thing is when you start to sort of look at these figures and then contrast them with with what's happening on TV, for example. So with TV, and this is actual sort of watching broadcast TV, not pre-record TV, is falling year on year. So the sort of classic mass media communication activity of using TV is just disappearing. And curious enough, actually, if we look at the next slide, you'll see that there was this sort of hope for TV surviving a little bit in COVID, which is this sort of COVID uplift as a result of COVID news, where you had this incredible increase in people watching TV and watching really stories about COVID, which sort of looked like it was going to rescue the broadcast industry in the same way as Donald Trump slightly rescued the broadcast industry in the US and cable TV in 2016. It looked like this was going to sort of give a boon to the industry. But once again, that's disappeared already. So this very, very short-lived, significant increase in people consuming online news TV and broadcast news has now disappeared also. And this has massive implications, of course, for the media. So moving on, when we start to look at how people intend to consume media as we go beyond the end of lockdown, you can see that really it's the online services which are going to have the most persistence. I talked about how we think these trends are there to stay. and I do believe they are, but the ones that are going to persist the most are going to be the online usage, the online TV, the music streaming services, as opposed to things like radio, where maybe any increased use in broadcast is likely to be short-lived. So this acceleration digital transformation has very, very serious implications for the media and their current revenue models. And what this means is if you start to look at the advertising figures, it's a disaster for the media. So if you look at, and this is really, the WARC figures are centered around the US rather than the UK specifically, but even if you look at the sort of potential impacts on GDP, the impacts on advertising are likely to be in a magnitude worse than we saw in 2008, 2009 in the financial crisis. Very, very sharp impact in terms of the amount of ad spend, which for media that relies on ad spend is very, very difficult. So if you mine down in a bit more detail into what this actually means, then a lot of the traditional areas have been incredibly badly hit. So magazines, you're looking at a hit of 21.5% reduction in advertising revenues compared to last year. Out of home, which is outdoor advertising, down 21.7%. Cinema, I think, is a special example. That's probably likely to come back. Because obviously cinemas have been closed, you can't operate there. And actually all across the board, even when you come to social media and online, once again, you are seeing this reduction, quite significant reduction in online advertising, but it's still an increase on last year. So all of the increase are happening on social and online and search and the digital arena, and other channels are disappearing. And given what we've said about people's behavior, this isn't a surprise, but it does have very, very serious implications for the survival of the media and also the strategies for communicating with people going forwards. And obviously some sectors have been hit more than others. So if you start to look at the sectors that have really been hit, transport and tourism, leisure and entertainment, that's not a surprise, or retail for that matter, but you may be more surprised to see how badly hit areas like financial services have been. So financial services, you would expect to be relatively resilient. I mean, the stock market is at an all-time high. Currently, the S&P 500, it should be a good time for financial services. But there's been really quite a big retrenchment in terms of spending across the board by all sectors. And once again, that has serious implications for the media going forwards. So if we look at the next slide, you can see that there will be a degree of sort of recovery going back towards the end of the year, but you're still going to see things like classified and other media way behind. You're going to see the digital recovering, and you can see in terms of the sort of longer term secular trends, to a large extent, it's a magnification of what we're already seeing. So if you look on the left hand side, already you are seeing press going down, already you're seeing radio and TV going down. So this has just accelerated massively this trend towards digital, and that's really happening now. So just moving forward, I'm just a little bit conscious of time. What does this mean for the media? Well, in terms of the mainstream media, it's not great news, as you'd expect. So obviously the business models of people like City AM and London Standard had to change as a result of this. We're seeing massive redundancies going across the board in most media companies, especially those that rely on display advertising. And we're actually seeing some publications closing down as a result of this. And I think it is important to distinguish between B2B and B2C in terms of the fact that B2C models tend to rely on advertising, and B2B models often rely on events or awards or other revenue generating opportunities like that. And of course, for them, that revenue's totally disappeared. So the impacts we talked about really have had a completely devastating impact on the media. And what this means, just wrapping up quickly because I am conscious of time here, is the end of print media, probably over the next few years as we're likely to see it, the end of a lot of local media, or the complete conversion onto digital, and all of this happening very, very quickly. So the acceleration we already saw, I would imagine within a year to 2 years, most print publications will disappear, or at least they'll become so niche that they won't really become a major source of communicating with clients compared to their digital equivalents. So just to summarize, this sort of creates this perfect sort of environment, I would argue, for what I call both convergence and integration. And convergence, we've all talked about for a very long time, this idea when paid media, owned media and earned media comes together. But I'd also look at this as being an opportunity, or rather a reflection of that point I made at the start about the change in the way that consumers behave. So this very significant way in which people have changed their behavior so that they don't just read one source of media, so that they flit between Google search, they flit between reading social media, they flit between reading the FT or Which or different trusted sources, and take information in different ways. And ensuring that your strategy and your approach takes into account these important secular trends and ensures that customer acquisition takes into account this very big change in people's behavior, very significant change in consumption of media, and this sort of fluidity between work and personal, at home, out and about, that we're starting to see, which has broken down the sort of last barriers, I would say, these very sort of siloed ways of thinking and working that people may have had previously. So that's a very sort of quick overview of the sort of secular trends we're seeing. I'm going to hand over now to Tom, who can talk about, okay, what is it that you can do about it pragmatically, and what should you be thinking about as a business to respond to these trends? So let me hand over to Tom now.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So just want to talk you through some of the opportunities ahead in the social media space. So, first of all, are the sheer numbers, that explain why your PR strategy should involve digital channels. In a lot of industries I work with, there's a tendency to think of paid social as part of just the advertising mix, but social is also a great opportunity to amplify your PR coverage. So that top number on screen there, 70% of UK adults using social media in the past month, 45 million people using social media in the UK. But of course, coverage depends on age and other demographics of your target audience. So, if you want to speak to pensioners, for example, social plays a much smaller role, because 97% of 16 to 24-year-olds are on social, through to perhaps around 35% in the latest figures on 65 plus. So, your audience really there determining the importance of social to the mix. And 49% say that they consume news via social media. And that's 35% from Facebook, 16% from Twitter, 13% from Instagram, with these numbers increasing each year. Now, Facebook increasing at a slower rate now than Twitter and Instagram, which are raising nicely, but all of them increasing year on year as a way of consuming news. I've used Facebook here as an example because they're the biggest game in town, and the numbers that they claim are absolutely massive. If you go on Facebook ads platform today and look, you'll see 44 million people over the age of 18 available to advertise to. Now, obviously, not all of those are using it regularly, but the numbers are staggering. And what we see as Facebook says that 27% of all mobile time is on Facebook, with an average of 14 checks per day. And they also say that they can reach 4 times the reach of all national newspapers combined. Now, YouTube and Instagram are kind of similarly massive. They're almost as big, but not necessarily as relevant for what we're talking about today, but absolutely great for advertising content in the form of pre-roll and compelling images and so on. Now, Twitter has over 13 million users in the UK. It's more male than most channels. But when you kind of get beyond the user base and into the influencers within the user base, you'll find that many of them are here. The journalists, the opinion formers, the commentators. And why wouldn't you be spending what would be comparatively tiny amounts of money keeping this audience informed, compared to what you'd spend on your advertising budget? And this is why it's such an important part of the mix. LinkedIn, increasingly part of my go-to PR digital strategy for reaching key people within an industry. 27 million users in the UK. Vast majority of them in surveys say that they log on at least once a week. But social media can't and shouldn't replace traditional PR. It can be very effective as part of the mix. Large numbers of people don't trust social as a source of information. 37% claim to trust social media as a source of news. That's a lot of people who don't. And that's where the kind of integrated mix comes in, because as well as being in publications and getting the press coverage and the editorials and the op-eds, they also serve as a really good proof point for social media. So while people may not trust social in and of itself, when you share content from publications that they do trust, that kind of mitigates some of that mistrust because the trust in media there is higher. However, 51% of people are restricting their settings in some way to prevent some targeted digital advertising from reaching them. 22% of people are using ad blockers. That won't affect directly into the social channels, but the audience networks that they offer will be affected by that. So you can see that there are kind of barriers towards making this your catch-all strategy, and another reason why it's part of the mix, not instead of traditional PR. But it's also a really valuable feedback loop. Often we feel we know what our audience want, and we deliver that content to them. What you get from organic and from paid social is sort of cold, hard, brutal feedback on what works and what doesn't. Now, and that can vary between whether or not it's organic or paid. So your audience may be engaging very well with your content and responding positively to it, but the larger audience you'd like to get to, the people you aspire to, when content is put in front of them, they may be slightly less engaged, and you may get very different feedback from that audience. Using this data can inform your PR strategy and your content, and then once you've changed the content as a result of this data, you can push it out again on social and see how it does with the changes. Now, I've used financial services in particular here as an example because I think there's a huge gap between different industries. Now, some of you in some industries on this call will be thinking, there's a lot here that we're doing already. Others may be feeling that, that there's some new information here to take in. And financial services is one that we've seen in a lot of cases. There's huge scope to do more in the digital PR space. Social media offers us the opportunity to enhance the reach of high quality content. Press coverage can be amplified using social channels to ensure more people see each piece of content. Why limit the reach of a piece in the media to those who happen to reach it on the day? The media coverage provides the excuse, provides the credibility to reach your target audiences. Digital targeting then ensures as many as people in your audience see the content. Now, this can take the form of organic sharing on your channels, but you're building your own channels and maintaining those is part of the equation, an absolutely vital one, but it's only part of the picture. We tend to use a lot of very small micro-targeted advertising campaigns to kind of push your PR further, to push the coverage of you to more people. And of course, influencers themselves can be part of the mix, both in terms of targeting those influencers online and pushing your content in front of them, but actually working directly with them as well, through sponsored content. But when you've got an influencer, you can either work with them, like collaborate with them, or you can go straight to their audience with your social targeting on social media and try and go round them in a way. But of course, this isn't in any way a substitute for what I'd call your advertising campaign. The advertising side of your business is very separate. There's an integration here, but it's not a replacement. This is about putting your earned media in front of a larger audience, not about putting your advertising content in front of that audience. Digital amplification of PR complements the advertising and complements the traditional PR if you work together throughout your teams to deliver it. So in terms of the way forward, the environment in which we will be in after the stats that Charlie presented to you there, we're talking about fewer publications, fewer opportunities for earned media, fewer pages, fewer journalists, the rise of authentic opinion formers, the citizen journalists, the trusted sources online. The increase of fake news has meant that more and more people turn to those that they trust to find out, information that they can rely on online. And what that means is that, trusted editorial endorsement has never been more important. Being able to show that those respected publications have said something about you and to push it out as far as possible is more and more critical. And authentic case studies and real people talking about you is so valuable and something that you should be pushing out digitally as well. And then taking all that and micro-targeting it so the right people see it at the right time. This stuff can, once you've put something out organically, putting it out paid can take, a matter of minutes, and you're responding very, very quickly and putting it out to your audience. So how could that look? I've used an example here of micro-targeting on Twitter because it's a place where this kind of targeting works particularly well. But there's kind of two ways of going about this. There's the traditional Twitter way. Twitter offers you the chance to do what is called lookalike audiences. So you can put in a list of Twitter handles or interests or demographics that you'd like to get to, and Twitter will find you people similar to those Twitter handles and interests. However, I find that first of all, there's no guarantee of what the lookalike is based on. It may be someone who is remarkably similar to your target audience. It may be people who support similar football teams to your target audience, and so you're going to get lots of inefficiency in a lookalike audience. So I prefer strategy of ripping audiences. So going to the Twitter accounts who have followers that you'd really like to get to, pulling all the names of their followers into a list, using a tool to pull them all into an Excel list, then uploading that list back into Twitter and saying, I only want to show this content to these specific people on this list. But that doesn't mean we're forgetting the more familiar stuff in the advertising space. Many of you will have social media retargeting pixels on your website for your advertising. Think about using those for your PR content as well. Make sure that those visiting your website are being served ads elsewhere, but they're also being served amplification of PR content, news stories about you and so on alongside the advertising. It's not an either or, both can happen at the same time. And just a couple of examples here of influencers and the types of influencers in the financial services space in particular. Increasingly brands turning to influencers, trusted commentators with large social media followings who help them to bypass the traditional media. Here are two examples of financial blogs. You've got Monevator. Monevator say very specifically, we do not accept unasked for guest post requests, and I do not do any text link advertising. And then the flip side of that is you've got Miss Mummy-Penny, who says, I'm happy to feature sponsored posts, affiliate advertising, social media posts on my website, my podcast, weekly newsletter, Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. I can also write content for your company blog or website. So there's opportunities in both here. So, those of you in the advertising space will look at Monevator and say, well, that's fine. You can still advertise onto that page. You can see an ad there on the sidebar. On Miss Mummy-Penny, you can go to her and engage with her and get her to collaborate with you on content. However, the micro-targeted approach means you can get to both their audiences on social media by targeting them directly rather than relying on the collaboration. So I'm just going to wrap up here by saying, if digital is already part of your PR mix, if you're sort of listening to what I'm saying and thinking, yeah, we're doing that already, have you changed that strategy since lockdown? Have you acknowledged that the world has changed and what worked in February won't be the optimal strategy now? Remember that commute to work post in the morning, it's gone. And one of my clients has just switched that to after 9 a.m. We tested it throughout August, and after 9 a.m. is a time that people are tending to switch on to Twitter instead of that morning commute now. They're starting to work earlier, to blend work and personal life much more, which means you can't rely on getting to them at those sort of peak moments like the commute. Paid allows your, sort of paid social media means your PR content is running throughout the day, not just at those peak moments, to capture people at the moments they choose to dip into social media. And if digital is not already a significant part of your PR mix, think about how your organization perceives digital comms. Do you think of it more as part of the advertising team or something completely separate? Is it something that is perhaps perceived as a bit of a hassle that maybe doesn't deliver? And if so, maybe it's time to think about your digital team as fully integrated into both PR and advertising, performing both functions. I'm going to hand back over to Charlie.
Thanks very much, Tom. So, I mean, obviously, it's a whistle-stop run through what is a very broad, significant topic, and obviously, the change in behaviour of society, the change in media consumption, the change in the way that people act is a massive area in itself. So we've obviously done a very sort of quick overview of what those secular changes are and some of the things you can do about it. What I'd be keen to at this point in time is to put out, to the audience for questions they may have. I do notice that we've already got one question in, which I'm going to put to Tom, which is, can digital content ever hope to be as trusted as classic broadcast and print outlets? Doesn't social's reputation for fake news damage trust in the platform and therefore the content on it? And if so, how would you advise brands build that sense of trust with their online audience? So Tom, if you want to have a go on that one.
It's a very good question. I mean, fake news is increasingly a reputation risk for Facebook, and we saw the advertising ban earlier, the advertising boycott earlier this year, when brands walked away as a result of Facebook's inability to police its own content. Having said that, something I talked about during my slides kind of is for me the ultimate way in which you build trust on social media, which is using that third-party content. So, you on your own saying stuff about you is going to be less trustworthy than you passing on things that respected sources have said about you. It's a traditional age-old kind of endorsement on an advert and so on. But in this case, it's saying, here's a piece that was written in a national paper in the trade press, and we're just passing that on to you. Here's an op-ed by our CEO that was taken by a respected publication, and therefore is considered to be of significant journalistic quality to pass the test with a major publication. So using a combination of other people's opinions of you, other people's coverage of you, and then interspersing that with good quality factual based content that people can go away and check out for themselves if they don't trust it, will help to build that brand trust over time. But I think that really shows why the traditional PR approach is in no way replaced by digital, because digital requires the content in order to be the proof points, to be the collateral that we use online to show that it's not just us pushing marketing on you. It's something nice that's been said elsewhere.
Great. We've got another question in, which I think is a very interesting one. Going back to news specifically on social media, and who decides what news is fake? The self-appointed fact checkers are not impartial. So we have a cynic amongst us who believes that actually what you're seeing on Facebook or other channels at the moment may not actually be impartial. So fake news, perennial problem, or is it? Are people quite savvy now to it?
I mean, I come from the election space originally. Before I worked with companies, I worked with political parties, and we've been watching this closely in that space for a long time, because what we saw first of all was the rise of was very deliberately fake channels. So the traditional way of doing it was, you come up with a town, you come up with the name of a newspaper, you stick them together, you make a half decent website, and you pump out content. And that was going on for years, sort of the New York Telegraph or something. And it sounds plausible, it sounds like something that may exist and people would read it and buy into it. I think increasingly people are checking more about whether or not the source that they've read online is correct. I totally agree that that there is someone has to make that decision. And if you were to ask some people, especially in the political space, if you were to ask some people what constitutes fake news, they'd list most of the mainstream media. So who makes that decision matters. There are You know, there are, for example, some parts of the independent UK media, the kind of the blogging space, that are still regulated. There are people that opt into things like Impress, and that means that at least they're able to show that they adhere to a code of conduct. I mean, ultimately, on the point about who you know, who moderates this stuff on social media, the big issue that's come, and you may have seen some of the coverage around this with YouTube and Facebook in particular, is staff becoming radicalized by the content that they're asked to moderate. So there is an ongoing risk here on those platforms. It is not in the business model of Facebook or YouTube or anyone else to actually regulate their content. That is not how they make money, and they will fight it and fight it and fight it. The responsibility for us is when we present our PR wins online, to do it from trusted sources, to not try and kind of bend the rules by, you know, going to publications that have a reputation for disseminating fake news and so on. Otherwise, the damage that they may do to themselves over time can kind of translate into our brands. But I mean, it is an age-old problem, and one that will not go away. I do favour some of the work that's been doing in the States at the moment around, there's some testing going on around how you prompt people just to think before they read something. And there are organisations pressuring hard, both in the UK and the States at the moment, for Facebook especially, but all social media channels, to rather than make an assessment themselves, to just ask people to consider what the source is, to think about what they've read, and to maybe double check it before sharing. But the problem of fake news will continue as long as viral content can be spread very, very quickly. And it's been made worse by channels such as WhatsApp. We have no idea what is shared on WhatsApp and the stuff that moves around on there. And so we can track to a degree things that come on Facebook. But, you know, I'd say stick to sources of information which your audience believe, and you're kind of in the right place.
Thanks, Tom. We've actually had another question, which I think is similar. I think it's a very good point about the quality of the content that you use, and whether you should go for something that's very polished, very professional looking, or something that's a bit more amateur, but maybe a little bit more authentic. So just be good just to get your thoughts on that, especially as you know, we talked about that convergence, that blurring between you know, what might be, I suppose, highly polished you know, content, or perhaps even, you know, a top advertising agency creating something that is masquerading as amateur content to look more authentic and to engage with people. So it's a very interesting question, I think, to take into account now we're starting to see this degree of convergence.
I feel in terms of quality, you know, the sort of quality and the polish on content, when we're talking about this kind of content, you know, I'm trying very much to focus today on you know, digital as a PR tool rather than as an advertising tool. I think there is more space on the PR side to chuck out what appears to be very quick fire content based on, you know, what's going on in the world, based on when a story is published, based on the fact that you've just been on TV and said something about your brand. So, you know, again, I brought this from the political space to the corporate space, but we do a lot of rough video in politics. You know, I want the quick iPhone video of a politician on the way out of an event, just them saying, we've just spoken to this big audience and everyone's raring to go and they're all excited about the election on Tuesday. In the same way, why wouldn't you, as part of the mix, if your CEO has just been on Sky News, why wouldn't you kind of film them on the way out saying, well, I've just been on Sky News and I've been talking about X, Y, Z, you know, and I hope you listened, tune in now and it'll be repeated, etc., etc. Kind of adding to the mix with that very real content that puts people in the heart of it. And of course, anything that is proof points from real people, I think works much better when it's done pretty raw. I have noticed with social over lockdown, it became so normal to see less polished content that I think that it's helped to normalize that. You know, we've all come to get used to the doorbell going on the, you know, when listening to the Today program in the morning. you know, or the child running into the room, which I'm hoping won't happen at the moment. I can hear him walking past. To make sure that kind of live feel of people being in the home is with us for at least a while and probably forever. And so why wouldn't you reflect that in your content? I think it looks good when we see your key players talking from their home environment or being humanized in the way of, you know, interruptions and so on. So when you're trying to plug the great coverage that you've earned, why not mix it up like that? So yes, share the article, but also do a little video of how pleased you are that it's been covered. Mix it up in that way, and that can be very raw and very unpolished content.
And actually, this sort of leads on nicely to another question we've come through, that's come through, which I think is a very important question, which is what's more effective, individual accounts or company accounts, if you're starting to use social media, if we are going to have this cult of personality, or are people more likely to engage with content that comes from a CEO rather than content that comes from a company feed, for example? Very, very important question. What are your thoughts on that, Tom? So
I tend to think of it that if I'm looking for a company, if I'm interested in a company, I'm looking up the company and I'm following the company's Twitter account. If I'm angry, I'm probably looking up the CEO and trying to tweet at them directly. So I think they have two separate purposes. I think seeing senior leaders of the business on social is really important. I think in places like LinkedIn, actually, like your corporate account sharing posts by your senior team, offering insights and commentary is a really, really nice way of showing the people in your business and personalizing it a bit. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's very much both. You know, you have to have the kind of the corporate social media account in order to provide that continuity. People come and go from companies, and you don't want to invest everything in a senior leader in your company and then they retire or move on. But at the same time, hearing them themselves and allowing them to respond to people and to respond to comments online really adds to the kind of authenticity that it's a two-way social conversation, not just broadcast. Because if we're gonna do more in the social space, we have to do it in a social way. It's not like the TV ad or the piece of coverage in the paper where nobody has the right of reply.
And actually linked to this, we just had a question through around using LinkedIn specifically as an own news platform, a company news blog. I mean, presumably you'd echo those sentiments in terms of talking about the fact that it shouldn't just be seen as a form of distributing content, but as a form of interacting and entering into conversation. So what are your thoughts? Is it effective, or do you think people just end up dumping content on their sort of corporate news blog on LinkedIn?
I think especially the article format on LinkedIn, which is a sort of more blog format, but that or a post, in either case, like if people are, if you're not getting any replies, keep at it. And if you are getting replies, respond to them, because those people are trying to engage in a conversation. And I've learned some fascinating stuff from the comments on my LinkedIn posts. I've met some interesting people in that way. LinkedIn is as social as the rest of social media. It's just a more professional work environment. We wouldn't do an event like this and not ask for questions at the end. That would seem weird. And in the same way, I wouldn't post to LinkedIn and not expect to engage in an audience. I mean, again, coming originally from politics, you don't get to post online and not get a lot of feedback from people who may be incredibly hostile to what you're saying. Not only is it an opportunity for persuasion, but it's more importantly, responding to any criticism or feedback online is therefore not just that person, but for the wider audience of people who might see that. And if you're just leaving something out there that's not answered, then that's kind of the final point people see. So the conversation matters, but also it just keeps your content moving. You get way more engagement on a piece if you're commenting and chatting back to the people that are asking you about it. So why wouldn't you do that just for the fact that you get bigger hit for your piece?
Quite an interesting article that someone's brought up now, which I think sort of raises a general point that we should probably talk about around ad blockers and paywall content, is this question of, because you talked about social amplification, so this idea you can take content you put somewhere and introduce it to a different audience on a different channel at a different point in time. The question is, how do you put that in front of the audience if it's behind a paywall? And I think as all of us who worked in communications and particularly media relations are aware of, clients, particularly our clients, are very keen on content that they can share with people that's not behind a paywall. Obviously, I've talked earlier about the financial challenges, the advertising challenges that media faces, and the fact that they need these paywalls because they need revenue. So what's the solution?
I mean, I tend to probably upset the media a bit in the way I deal with this stuff, but it's obviously respecting the paywall is paramount. It's, you've had a piece of coverage. However, if you've got quotes in that piece that are your quotes, or it's your op-ed, I then don't have a problem with using a quote or two from that on a shareable graphic or something like that, which just indicates that that's a flavour of the content that someone will get if they pay and click through. So giving a taster in the same way that they will do themselves. And if you feel that's inappropriate, look for them sharing the article and share what they've said about it, because at least then you're kind of keeping the media entity on board. But ultimately, if it was your content to start with, I think just, using a couple of snippets, a little graphic, picture the face of the person speaking it, a little quote and a click through for more, etc., is not too bad. So much of social is, and this comes back to the fake news point actually, of, headlines in fake news matter a lot. And the reason they matter a lot is because most people don't click through. They see a point that confirms their worldview and they retweet it or share it. And so if you are sharing a piece of content that's paywalled and some of your audience aren't going to be able to see that, they are able to have learned that that piece exists and that you were covered in that place, and give you a kind of credibility point off the back of the fact that it exists at all. So it's not a disaster, but I do have nightmares whenever anything's behind a paywall. It's always obviously much easier when it's not, and much more useful for social, but it's not the end of the world.
And in terms of ad blockers then, does that impact in terms of an amplification strategy? You're trying to put sponsored content, or is that more of an issue just with digital advertising?
I mean, it affects the audience networks. So the kind of the wider stuff when Facebook and LinkedIn and others offer to get your content beyond their platform. I don't think ad blockers are going to go away, but they are a relative. I mean, 1 in 5 people are using some form of ad blocker or have used some kind of ad blocker. There's a debate back and forth about whether it's okay to restrict content to people that have ad blockers, and I don't think that debate's finished, although there's some legal arguments around that at the moment. Ultimately, we have to be able to pay for journalism in some way. The era of totally free media is gone, and if publications aren't able to make money from advertising, they go under. So that argument will roll on, but in the meantime, social gives us the chance to get to large numbers of people, whether they're using ad blockers or not, and to still show them ads. The bigger risk in social is people opting out of targeted advertising rather than trying to block it. But it doesn't mean that, most of us never check those settings. And unless there is a significant backlash to this, it continues to be an effective tool. And social media platforms are aware that bad advertising will lose them the opportunity to target people. They are obsessed with putting relevant content in front of the right people. So the dream for social media platforms, and the one they work towards, is where you want the advertising because it's relevant to you, and they're all striving towards that. So it does mean that as targeting gets more efficient over time, using a micro list of people that you genuinely think are interested in your content remains a good strategy, even if you're losing 20% of them or so to or even 50% in the case of some restrictions on ad content. Why wouldn't you put that in the mix?
I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to ask that there's 2 more questions I want to ask. And the first one that's come through, I think it's a very valid one, is influencers. Are they worth it? Should you pay for them? First question.
I suppose, without meaning to offend the influencer world in any way, the quality varies and their influence varies, and they can be expensive. I think there's absolutely a place for respected people within your sector adding to the conversation and helping you to get your message out. I also think that there is a place for targeting their audiences directly. It's not, it's not something that's going to be obvious to the influencers that you're targeting. You're targeting by following, for example, on Twitter. And if you're kind of mixing up and targeting a few people's followings, all you're doing is really trying to build a really rich set of people who are really interested in the sector. So opportunities to work with, but also opportunities to go around influencers with targeted ads. I say that with apologies to anyone who might be an influencer on the line.
Thanks, Tom. One last question very, very quickly, and then we'll wrap up. So that's a great one. So is there an art to drafting a killer social media post? How many hashtags is optimum? How do you relay your message in only a few characters? And you've got 30 seconds to do that.
It depends on your audience is unfortunately the answer to that. What works with one audience will not work so well with another. Keep it short, keep it simple. There is no nuance on social media, especially in places like Twitter, a bit more on LinkedIn. Test long posts. I was talking to you before about the time of day piece that I did in August with a client. Test long versus short, hashtags versus not hashtags, links versus not links, video versus image. Find out what works. Every audience on every social media channel is different, and that's true for both your organic audience and any paid audience you go to. And again, be really aware that something that works for your organic audience may completely bomb with your paid audience. You have to do all that work again with the paid audiences to see what works and what doesn't. So sadly, no kind of magic formula. Plenty of things out there written about, the ideal length of copy and so on, but test your audience, know your audience, and respond to what they like.
That was nearly 30 seconds. Great. Well, I think we'll wrap up now. So I'll hand over to Vanessa to wrap up. But thank you all very much for listening. And of course, if you do have any questions, our details are on the website, and we'll be sending a follow-up from this webinar anyway. But I'll hand you over now to Vanessa.
Just to reiterate, thank you so much, Charlie and Tom, for that. It was really, really interesting and really useful. And I hope there were some tips there for everybody. And just to reiterate what Charlie said, if you'd like any more information, clients, you know our numbers and emails, so please get in touch. And anybody else who's watching, please get in touch with the Newgate website, or you can contact me and I'll forward your email on to the right person. We'd love to help, and as always, happy to have a no obligation chat. Thanks everybody, and hope you can join us again soon.